Today, you'll not only see the full process behind how to create a poster like this in Photoshop, but learn some insanely fun ways to creatively blend text, images, and brushes together. We'll be going from square one, cutting out and refining our subject, blending background layers, color grading, adding layered text effects, and so much more. I'm super excited to share this one with you, but because there is a ton being covered, we will be moving a little bit faster than normal. So if some of the steps that we cover here feel a bit overwhelming, I think you'll get a ton from my free Photoshop Quick Start Guide ebook, which helps you get up to speed on the most important tools and processes of Photoshop that we won't be covering here in today's lesson. So if you want to grab your copy of that free ebook, just hit the link in the description below. But with that, let's get this poster party started. Now, to begin, the project dimensions that we're going to use is just going to be the size of a standard piece of paper. To create this project, from the Photoshop start screen, I'll just go to New File. From there, we can just go to the print options and then choose the letter preset, which is just going to be a piece of paper. From there, we can click Create. With our new document, we're ready to go and import our first photo, which in this case is the soccer player in my particular example. Now, all the images that I'm using, I got from Adobe Stock. I had to pay for them, so that's why I can't share them with you in this tutorial. However, you could probably go and find similar photos for yourself to practice with on something like Unsplash or Pexels.com. So to add that photo into my image, I'm just going to drag and drop it from my computer. Finding it on my computer and then clicking and dragging that onto my canvas, it will now be placed like so. Since we want to remove the background from our subject, I'm going to go ahead and utilize the Select Subject button. So I'll click on that inside of the contextual taskbar at the bottom of the canvas while that image layer is selected. I'm going to rename this image layer to Player because there's going to be a lot of layers in this project and it will quickly get confusing. Now, if I zoom in, you can see that there are some problem areas where the selection didn't perfectly select our subject. So what we can do is use the Quick Selection tool to touch this up. Going up to the Quick Selection tool, or you can press W on your keyboard to access it, I'm just going to go and paint over the areas that the Select Subject missed. So I'm just going to do my best to touch this up, and then we'll have to go and do some refinements afterwards, but we just need good enough for now. So this looks fine to me. Everything looks reasonably selected. So we're going to apply this to a layer mask so that we remove the background non-destructively. With our active selection and that layer selected, we can just click on the layer mask icon to remove that background. But if I zoom in even further, you can see that there's lots of little weird issues around the edges, which means that we need to go and touch this up. The easiest way to do that is using the Select and Mask workspace, which can always be accessed simply by double-clicking on your layer mask thumbnail. Double-clicking on that layer mask thumbnail, I'll go and set the view up here to on white, so that way I can more easily see the edges that I'm working with. Now what we need to do is just go and touch up these different edges around our player. And in some cases, you can go and use the Refine Edge brush tool right here. But because we have such a similar bit of fringing compared to the skin color, then it's going to have a hard time to actually remove it. So as you see here, it's not going to do the greatest job to remove that. So we're going to have to do some manual brushing. So clicking on my brush tool here inside the Select and Mask workspace, I can just hold Alt or Option and then go and paint over the edges that I need to touch up. Now, the way that this will work is the outer edge of your brush is going to be the area that is removing from your mask. So we're just going to go and paint around those edges nice and closely here until we're happy with how things are looking. If you make a mistake, you can always press Command or Control Z to undo that. But again, I'm just holding Alt or Option to subtract from that area. And I'm just doing small brush strokes around the problem edges within my selection. Now, this might take you a little bit of time. As you can see here in this particular example, I have quite a bit to do, but I already went ahead and did this before this tutorial so that I can basically move things along and just continue showing you the steps. However, once you've gone and done this manual touch-up with your selection inside the Select and Mask workspace, what you can do is then go and adjust the global refinements. Using the global refinement slider, you can get rid of little bits of fringing, such as around the jersey right here. You can see how we just have that little bit of a darker line. This isn't something that we'd want to manually touch up. It'd be a little bit faster just to touch it up with the global refinements here. Now, within these global refinements, if you increase the smoothing slider, that's going to basically smooth out any jagged edges around your subject. The feather slider is going to blur those edges slightly, so we'll do just a very small amount there. And then for the contrast, that's going to take that blur that was created with the feather, and it's going to make that sharp once again, so then we'll have a nice crisp edge. So you can play around with these sliders sliders to find something that works for you, and I'll leave a tutorial below this video sharing how you can use this workspace to smooth the edges in any selection, but that's a little bit outside of today's tutorial. The final thing we can do is the Shift Edge option, which you can decrease, and it's going to move your selection edge inward by a certain percentage, and then that way you'll get rid of some fringing. Just be sure to look around your entire selection in case there's any weird mistakes. Once you're complete inside of the Select and Mask workspace, I would recommend setting the output to New Layer with Layer Mask. But because I've already gone ahead and done this, I'm just going to bring in the previously cut out person into my project. So once you've gone and finished inside of the Select and Mask workspace, you should have something like this with your single player layer with a layer mask that has now been refined with the Select and Mask workspace. The next thing I'm going to do is go and add my background images. The first is going to be a soccer field behind my subject. So once again, going to my images on my computer, I'm going to access that file, click and drag it onto my canvas like so. Now I'm going to scale this up, and I basically want this soccer net to be relatively large behind my subject and just over on the right side. Something like this works good enough for me. I'll make sure to press the check mark to commit to those changes. Because we want this to be behind our subject, of course we want to have this image layer below our player layer, and I'm going to rename this to Field. Now I'm ready to go and import my two crowd photos that I'm going to be blending in above the sky, I suppose, of the field. So once again, going down to my computer files, I'm going to hold Command or Control, click on those two images, and then drag them onto my canvas like so. To begin, I'll go and just take this photo and scale it up over this way. If you don't see this transform box around your image layer, just make sure to access the Move tool by pressing V, and then ensure that you have Show Transform Controls enabled up in the options bar while your Move tool is active. So what I'm going to do here is just scale this up like so. Something like that looks fine to me, maybe down a little bit. And then we'll go and grab the next photo, clicking on that in the Layers panel. I'll press Command or Control T, right click, and flip this horizontally because I kind of want to look like there's a bowl coming in behind the subject. And so I'm going to put this right around here, maybe scale it up just a touch, and that looks good enough for me. Now obviously these two images in the background do not blend together. So let's go and use some layer masks to quickly remove the harsh edge from this topmost image layer. I'm going to rename this to Right Crowd, and I'll rename the other layer to Left Crowd. With my right crowd layer selected, I'm going to add a layer mask, grab the brush tool by pressing B, and using a soft round brush here with a 0% hardness, I'm gonna make sure my foreground color is set to black, scale up that brush using the bracket keys, and I'll just go and paint over the edges of this photo so that it doesn't have those harsh edges anymore, and it kind of blends in with the other image. Now from there, to make this blend a little bit softer, I'm gonna press 5 on my keyboard, and so I have a 50% opacity brush, and I'm just going to blend in this top area a little bit more so things just look a little bit more seamless than they did before. You can play around with different brush opacities to blend in your background photos. It's a great way to do this type of thing in your poster creations. Now from there, both of these photos of course have that harsh edge along the bottom, and to easily manage that, I'm going to shift click both of these layers, press Command or Control G, so now both of those crowd layers are in one group, and I'm going to rename this group to Crowd. With that crowd group selected, I'll add a layer mask, which will now apply to both of the images inside of that group. And once again, with that soft brush, foreground color set to black, I'm gonna go and just paint over the bottom edge of these images, press 0 to set the brush opacity to 100% so that we actually do get rid of those edges like so. And then I'll grab my Move tool by pressing V, scale this up, and just play around with this so I can get a bit of a nicer, more seamless blend into the other photo. There is no right or wrong with this type of stuff, so take a moment to just scale your layers around until you're happy with the result that you have, and then of course use your layer masks to adjust the visibility of things as needed. So now with the general elements of our project placed, we can start to blend the background together, because of course this doesn't look very good. What I want to do is add sort of a gray, black, and blue background, and the easiest way to do that is to use a gradient map. If you want to learn more about gradient maps, I get way more in depth into it in this video here if you want to check it out, but I'm just going to quickly run through the process. With the crowd group layer selected, because that's what I want to edit, I'll go to my adjustments panel and then go and find the gradient map adjustment, which is right here. So choosing that gradient map, placing it directly above that group that I want to edit, I'll right click on that gradient map layer and go to create clipping mask. That way, this gradient map will only affect that crowd. I'll click on this gradient preview to open up the gradient editor, and then I'll click on this color swatch right here. I'll then click on the color thumbnail for that swatch, and we're going to use a dark gray color, which in this case is 1C, 1C, 1C. I'll click OK, and now I'll go and choose the other color, click on the color thumbnail, and this time we're going to change the color to 89E6F7, which is sort of this baby blue color. I'll click OK. Now I want this blue color to be a little bit more dominant in the background, so I'm going to click on this little point right here, and then click and drag this over like so that now that blue is going to be more visible and more dominant in that background image, because the blue color is going to appear earlier on within our exposure range. So with that complete, I'll click OK. Now let's go and do a similar thing for the field. But to make our life easy, we can just duplicate this gradient map layer by clicking on it and pressing Command or Control J to duplicate it. I'll now click and drag this layer down to be directly above my field layer, right click on that gradient map copy and go to clipping mask. This will now create a clipping mask on that field layer. So now I can affect the adjustments for this field, which is going to be different from our crowd. So double clicking on that gradient thumbnail, clicking on the gradient editor. This time we're going to make some slight changes so that the field looks a little bit more dark. In order to reduce the intensity of those blues, I'm going to click on this darker color swatch and set the location to 29, which is just going to increase the intensity of that dark gray color, and so it will affect more of my photo. We can then click on this midpoint here and adjust this as well to refine that look. I'll click OK, and now we're done with our blending of the background. Now, before we start blending the player into the image, I just want to quickly remind you of that free Photoshop Quick Start guide below this video. If any of the steps that we've been covering so far have felt a bit daunting, what I share in that free ebook will help you feel like you're standing on your feet again in Photoshop. So to grab your copy of that, just hit the link in the description below, type in your name and email, and you'll instantly receive your download link. By signing up to my email list, you'll also get first dibs on all my future cheat sheets and ebooks. So if you love Photoshop as much as I do, it's the perfect place to be. Again, the link for that is below this video, and while you're there, make sure to hit the like button to let me know you're enjoying the tutorial so far. So now we have successfully blended the background of our photo and are ready to go and add some effects to our player. So going up to the player layer in my layers panel, I'm going to add a neural filter which will apply some cool textures onto our subject and just make things look a little bit more gritty. But before we do that, I'm going to grab my move tool by pressing V and then just scale this player down a little bit and position him somewhere around here, because I want to have some text showing up in the background in the final poster. So something like this will look good enough for me for now. Now to access this neural filter, we can just click on that player layer and go up to Filter, and then down here to Neural Filters. Inside of the Neural Filter window, we'll make sure that we click on the Style Transfer option and enable that. And then I'll go to my image styles, scroll down, and I'm going to choose this one with the red flower and the gray background. This will apply this sort of interesting texture, and it might take a second to load onto your photo. But as you can see, it sort of gives this really weird look to our player. But if we lower that style opacity to something like 20 to 30%, for example, then it's just going to add this really subtle look. We can then enable the preserve color option so that those red tones are not added into the photo, and instead we just get this cool texture across our entire player. So with that looking good to go, we'll set the output here to new layer masked. With that, I'll click OK. This will create a new player layer with that texture on it. So I'm going to double click on this layer and call this to texture. Now with this texture layer, we can blend it in even further by double clicking on that layer to open the layer styles, and then I'll just use the underlying layer slider of the blend if option here to basically just reduce the visibility of this texture within the shadows, and I'll hold Alt or Option to separate that out and feather things. So that way it doesn't make our subject look overwhelmingly textured in all areas of his body, but it's only going to be visible more in the midtones and the highlights of the photo rather than in the darkest tones. With that, I'll click OK. Now, since I have two different layers that are related to my player, I'm going to shift click both these layers, press Command or Control G to group them, and then I'll call this to player. Now to blend this player into the background, we're going to do a similar thing with a gradient map adjustment layer. So with that player group selected, I'm going to go and access the gradient map adjustment right here. And then I'll right click on that layer and go to create clipping mask. Now to edit this gradient, I'll click on the gradient editor and I'm just going to be using the black to white gradient, which can be found inside of your basics, or the foreground to background gradient, which is going to be your foreground and your background color, which is black and white for me. With that complete, I'll click OK, and I'll just lower the opacity of this gradient map layer just a little bit so that we get a little bit more color into the player, but it still has this grungy sort of look. With that complete, I want to now add sort of a blue highlight on one half of his body by creating a new layer above the gradient map layer, right-clicking, and going to create clipping mask. I'll call this to blue highlight. And now we'll go and choose a blue color by clicking on that foreground color swatch, and we're going to use a similar blue to the background. Typing in the color swatch that I wanted there, or you can click and drag your mouse around to choose a color that you would like. I'll click OK. Now, once again, using the brush tool by pressing B on your keyboard, I'm just using a soft round brush with a 100% flow and opacity. With that blue highlight layer selected, I'm just going to go and paint over my subject like this, just adding that blue on one half of his body with a soft transition out. Now to blend that color into the subject, I'll make sure to set the layer blending mode from normal down here to overlay, soft light, hard light, or vivid light, depending on your project. I'm going to use the overlay one for this example. With that layer all blended in, you can go and add more color if you would like, just by continuing to paint over your subject with your brush, and it's just going to still blend things in based on that layer blending mode. So now that we have this nice color added, let's go and add some text into this project. I'm going to select my type tool by pressing T and click once on my canvas. I'm going to write Rise, and I'm using the Bernoru font. If you want to access that, I'll leave a link for it below this video. For the color of this text, I'm just using a similar blue to the background, and I'll just press the check mark to commit to those changes. Now to scale up this piece of text, I'll just grab my Move tool by pressing V and then scale this piece of text to basically fit the width of my poster. Now I want this text to be sort of angled at a diagonal line. So I'll press Command or Control T, then hold Command or Control and click on this bottom anchor point, and then just drag up like so. If you hold the Shift key, it will keep things uniform as you do this. So holding Command or Control and Shift at the same time here, I'll do something like this. And press the check mark to save those changes. I'll now move this up just above my player's head like so. And then now we'll set the layer blending mode for this text from normal down here to color burn. Next, I'd like to add sort of a outline to this text. So what I'll do is just press Command or Control J to duplicate that type layer, but now we'll go to our fill option and set this to 0%. That's going to make the text transparent. However, if I double click on that text layer, that duplicated text layer, to open the layer styles, I'll add a stroke, and then we can click on the color thumbnail, set this to our desired color, which in this case is white, and then I'll just increase this a little bit, maybe to like 10 or I guess 9 pixels is good enough for me. I'll click OK. Now with that good to go, I'll grab my Move tool on that duplicated text layer, and I'm just going to move it up and to the right just a little so it sort of has like this pop out stroke outline effect here. You can use your arrow keys on your keyboard to bump it into place. With this looking good to go, I'll shift click both of these layers, grab my Move tool, and I'm just going to reposition this as needed. And I might center this up as well by pressing Command or Control A to select my entire canvas. With both of those layers selected, I will center my text like so. Press Command or Control D to deselect that. Now I want these type layers to sit behind my player's head. So I'm going to click on those type layers and drag them below my player group. So now they're going to be behind my subject. The final thing that I would like to do to these text layers is add a texture to that blue filled text, which is this bottom-most text layer. To do that, I already have an image that I'll go and access on my computer, and then I'll go and select that particular photo, drag and drop it into place like so. It's basically just this photo of sand that's black and white, and I'm just going to scale this up using the Move tool and position it into place like so. Now, because I have a layer blending mode active for this type layer, that means I can't just use a clipping mask. So instead, we can use a selection and a layer mask to make sure that this image only fits within this text. To create a selection of your text, just hold Command or Control and click on the T icon of your desired type layer to create an active selection. Then with that texture layer selected, I'll click the layer mask icon to apply that selection onto the layer mask, so now that image is only visible there. Now I can change the layer blending mode of that texture layer from normal down here to overlay, for example, and then we can lower the opacity to blend things in as needed, like so. I'll rename this to type texture. Now the final thing I'll do before finishing up with this background text is just click on the texture layer, hold Command or Control, click on the Rise layer, and then I'll click on this link icon. So then that way both of these layers are linked, and whenever I move one, the other will be moved as well, so I don't need to worry about that. I'll then just go and group these layers just so they take up less space in my layers panel. Hold Command or Control, click that topmost text layer, press Command or Control G, and I'll call this group to Rise text. Now I want to go and add some additional text at the bottom of this poster saying the two team names and the date of the game. So I'll once again select my type tool by pressing T, click on the image to create a new type layer, and I'll do Renegades versus Grizzlies. I'll then highlight all of that text and set the color of that text to white. Then I'll click and drag that text above my player group and all of its related layers so that it is going to sit above everything else. I'll scale this up and position it into place using my smart guides to make sure it is perfectly centered. Now with this complete, I'm going to use the blend if adjustment to make this text layer sort of blend into the shadows a little bit better, make it look a bit more grungy. Double clicking on that type layer, I'll go to my underlying layer slider and then click and drag up those shadows a little bit until things start to disappear. Then hold the Alt or Option key to feather this out and just add a little bit of grunge to it like so. Once you're happy with that adjustment, you can just click OK. Now I want to do a similar thing with this outline, so I'll press Command or Control J to duplicate that bottom type layer. Then I'll set the fill to 0%, double click on that layer to open the layer styles, enable the stroke option. I'll set the stroke to a blue color, click OK, and I'll set the size to 2 pixels and click OK once again. Now I'll grab my move tool and just move that outline over and down a little bit, then use my arrow keys just to position that as needed. So it just adds this sort of fun little extra effect to the text. Finally, I'll grab my type tool once again by pressing T, click on my canvas, and I'll just do Jan 14th for the date of the game, press the check mark to commit to those changes, grab my move tool, and then go and place this in the center of my photo once again. If you're not sure if anything is centered, just again press Command or Control A, access the move tool by pressing V, and then with your desired layer selected, you can just click on the align horizontally or align vertically option depending on what you're trying to do. Once again, I'm going to double click on that January 14th layer and then use the underlying layer slider of the blend if adjustment to just make that blend into the background a little bit more and help with that grungy look. Holding Alt or Option to feather this out. Now with this looking good to go, I'll just shift click all of these layers, grab my move tool, and I'll just move this down slightly so that the date is not right along the player's feet. Then I'll press Command or Control G to group those layers, and I'll call this to info text. Now the majority of our poster is done, but we have some fun effects that we can add to blend everything together, and the first thing that we're going to do is add some smoke brushes around the entire photo. So clicking on the new layer icon, so it creates a new layer at the top of the layer stack, I'll call this to smoke. Now I'll grab my brush tool by pressing B and then go and access my smoke brushes. If you are a member of my course 21 Day Photoshop Expert, you would have access to all of these brushes, so be sure to go and use those. If you are not a member of the course, that is okay. You can find some other smoke brushes online. I'll leave some resources below to help you find some of those brushes for yourself. In this case, I'm just going to go and choose some random smoke brushes here and begin to add them onto my photo. The first color that I'm going to use is going to be that same blue color from the background, so that light blue. With that smoke layer selected, my brush opacity and flow at 100%, I can just click around my image as if this is like a stamp. It might be easier if you have a mouse to do this, because then you can just click in one area and the pen pressure won't affect anything. But I would recommend just going through and choosing a bunch of different brushes for your smoke to basically look randomized around your photo. So I'm just going back and forth between all of these different brushes to add some smoke with this one particular color for now. Once you've gone through with your first color, I'm going to change this to white for this particular example. Click OK. With that same layer selected, I'm going to once again go and just paint some brush strokes around the photo to add some fun smoke effects, this time with a slightly different color. I just want to be subtle with it, and you can even lower the brush opacity by pressing the numbers at the top of your keyboard to add some more subtle smoke effects over different areas of your image. Finally, I'll set the foreground color to black, and then we'll go and do some more smoke brush adjustments here with the black brushes, just so that everything sort of blends in a little bit nicer overall. Once you're happy with all of your smoke adjustments, because I don't want this to affect my type layer, I'm going to click and drag this smoke underneath the info text so that that info text still blends in nicely. I'm also going to update the blend diff of that January layer so that it doesn't look too blended like it does right now. Now that our smoke adjustments are complete, or whatever other creative brush adjustments you want to add into your poster are complete, we can now do our final adjustments, which is going to be our contrast and then our color grading adjustments. So clicking on the topmost layer in your layer stack, I'm going to create a new curves adjustment layer from the adjustments panel. The layer was added into a particular group, so I'll just click and drag this up to be outside of that group. I'll now go and click on the highlights point to drag this up to boost the highlights, then click in the shadows and drag down to increase the intensity of those shadows. You can play around with this, there's no right or wrong, just do what you think looks best. With this complete, the next thing I'm going to do is add a color balance adjustment layer from the adjustments panel once again. To ensure that the colors from this color balance adjustment layer blend nicely into the photo, I'm going to click on that layer mask thumbnail and go up to image, down here to apply image. Make sure that this is set to merged, RGB, blending mode normal, 100% opacity, and click OK. As you can see, it applies the exposure of our image onto this layer mask, so then when we go and adjust these colors, it just blends in a little bit better, in my opinion. So you can play around with this until you're happy with the result. Just within the midtones here is generally all you need for your poster, but just play around with this until you're happy with the result once again. Now we're nearly complete, but there's one final thing I'd like to do, which is just darkening up the foreground here to cover up the feet and therefore also make this text a little bit easier to read. So I'll click the new layer icon to create a new layer. I'll call this to foreground gradient. Grab my gradient tool by pressing G. Make sure that I am using a foreground to transparent gradient with the linear gradient enabled. I'll set my foreground color to black and now click and drag out like so to apply that gradient. You can adjust either point here to move where that gradient is visible. From there, I'll change the layer blending mode of that gradient down here to something like overlay, soft light, or hard light. In this case, I think soft light looks pretty good to me. And from there, I'm just going to click and drag that foreground gradient beneath my general adjustment layers like so, and everything is looking good to go. And now with that final gradient added, our poster is complete. So this was just one of many ways to create a poster in Photoshop, but hopefully you're walking away from this tutorial feeling inspired and excited to create some epic posters of your own. Although this final result looks pretty complicated, when we break it down into little steps, it's actually not so hard to wrap your head around. So if you made it this far in the video, be sure to hit that like button, and if you haven't already, consider subscribing to keep up to date with more tutorials like this one. Anyways, that is all for this video, and I'll catch you back here next time.